Welcome to this video about controversial and interesting negligence cases. So I'm just going to get the PowerPoint up, share my screen. Great. All right. My name's Sian Hobill. This is a video for my torts students. We're studying Law 202, which is Torts B, otherwise known as the Law of Negligence. The aim of this lecture is to take some of the theoretical principles we've been learning, the elements of negligence, and try and apply them to some broader or wider situations. And I'm going to give you some really interesting and controversial cases that we can look at. So you'll see that these principles of negligence that we've been learning actually do apply in the real world and the bigger world too, as in the international community. So some of the examples that we're going to look at today: tobacco, asbestos, obesity, sugar, asylum seekers, stolen generations, environmental disasters, the bushfires and the floods, and then also we'll talk a little bit about class actions. So let's recap on our principles or the elements of negligence that we've been learning. So firstly, the time limit. As we know, in Queensland, the limit is 3 years from the date the cause of action arose. It's pretty standard in all of the states and territories in Australia now, that 3-year time limit, although it can be different, so you have to check your jurisdiction. If you're dealing with an international case, there might be some issues about time limits. So you'll always have to be coming back to, well, what laws are you relying on in order to prove your case? Duty of care. We know now that there's two things we look at when we're looking at whether there's a duty of care. So does it fall into a special category of cases? So there's been a lot of litigation or there's court decisions about a particular situation. We know most of the common ones by now: employer, employee, occupiers, liability, those sorts of things. Or is it a novel duty of care case? So some of the more controversial negligence cases that we look at today, this issue of a novel duty of care arises. So we've learned about the salient features test when looking at novel situations, and those are the sorts of principles that we'd be applying to see if we could find a duty of care. Once we've established whether it falls into a category or whether it's novel, we then look to the scope of the duty of care. So what is it that the plaintiff owed the defendant? How far does their duty extend to ensure reasonable care? And we'll talk about that as we go through our examples. Breach. Has the defendant's conduct breached the duty of care? So really that question is, has it fallen below the reasonable standard that has been set? And the reasonable standard that has been set, or the scope of the duty of care, remember we look to things such as policies and regulations that are in place. Perhaps there's laws that are in place, or we come up with the idea about what a reasonable standard of care is, looking at similar situations. Causation. There's two parts to causation, which we've now learnt: factual cause and to make sure that the damage is not too remote. So is there something that arises on the facts which shows that there has been a break in the causal link? We can talk about it that way. Or there's been a new event that's come up which shows that perhaps the plaintiff shouldn't be responsible for the damage that's caused. Or the other part where causation gets tricky is whether the damage is actually as a result of the breach of the duty of care. So that's where we can see that the actual injury or the harm itself is multifactorial. So are there many different things that have caused that injury or that harm? If there's many different things, then we have to show that the breach of the duty of care materially contributed to that harm or injury. And damage, as we know, we must show in a negligence case that there has been legally recognised damage or harm. If it's not legally recognised, then we won't succeed on that either. So we know by now that it's actually really, really difficult to bring a negligence claim. It's not a walk in the park, and the plaintiff has to prove all of those things. And then once they've managed to do that, the defendant might have a defence. So the defences can be contributory negligence. So is there something that the plaintiff has done which has contributed to the damage or the harm? And perhaps there's voluntary assumption of risk. So is it a risky or dangerous activity? Has the plaintiff engaged in that, and should that be a defence? Then when it comes to international cases, or even cases in between the different states and territories in Australia, or perhaps you're looking at cases, class actions, then there might be massive issues of jurisdiction. So when I talk about jurisdiction, I mean what law are we going to apply? In Australia, we know we've got our two-tiered system of laws or government. We've got the federal jurisdiction, and then we've got the state and territory jurisdictions. So we need to figure out where the action occurred, and then what laws are going to apply. If you have a multinational corporation, for example, and a case involving an oil spill, perhaps, then you've got these big issues coming up about jurisdiction. Well, what is the forum in which we're going to bring our legal proceedings for negligence? And often you might have to compare different jurisdictions and then make a decision as to which is going to be the best way to proceed. Now, negligence doesn't exist in a vacuum like most other laws. There will always be crossover. When it comes to these controversial cases, then there's usually a lot of crossover between other laws. So you've got international law, human rights law, criminal law, corporate and contract laws, industrial laws, all sorts. So negligence can sometimes just be one of the allegations or a couple of the allegations, and then you'll find that in the mix there's these other allegations that are coming up under these other areas of law. So let's start with a relatively well-known controversial area of litigation, the tobacco industry. By now, after the last sort of 50 years, we've heard a lot in the media and so forth about the tobacco industry and the litigation that's occurred there. Now, I've got a musician friend, and he's got a song here about smoking, so we're going to play that. When he's not traveling around the world singing about quirky little things like all the girls that he's kissed, he actually comes up with some pretty cool stuff. So we'll get him up.
Cigarettes for breakfast, lunch and coffee black. And this precious chest for singing. Shouldn't be waking up to this noise.
So we know with cigarettes that they were marketed to everybody, everyone and everybody. Up until the 90s in Australia, cigarette smoke was just everywhere. I mean, look at this ad, the Marlboro ad. They've got a baby on it. Smoking was really cool. It was something that was promoted during the war. People were sending over cigarettes, and they even had their own special brands, especially for the Vietnam War. That was really big. Here's another ad about, you've got Santa Claus marketing cigarettes. A great one here about mothers, why women should smoke when they're pregnant. Apparently it keeps you calm. And then you should continue smoking when you've got a baby. And look at this, here's one here about doctors. More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. So now we have the medical profession endorsing smoking, which is crazy stuff. In Australia, well, all around the world, you could smoke on a plane. So small and confined spaces, everybody was smoking. And at some point, airlines decided, well, perhaps maybe we should have an area where there's non-smoking. So they just put a curtain up so you could smoke behind the curtain, but not in front of the curtain, or in front of the curtain, not behind, because that's going to make a difference, isn't it? I'll just turn our friend off. Okay. So there was a case, a 1996 case, an interesting case. A airline passenger, Mrs. Cameron, claimed that she and others suffered losses because they were assigned smoking seats on an international flight after they had specifically requested non-smoking seats. She claimed that she suffered bronchitis, and by this time there was an act in place, which was the Trade Practices Act, and she was trying to say there was no act in place about having smoke-free zones, or cigarette use in confined spaces hadn't been banned yet. So she was trying to rely on the Trade Practices Act by saying that there had been false and misleading conduct as a result of being sold a ticket on the basis that there would be no smoking. So she virtually won that case, but then if we think back to our elements of causation and the damage, she lost on that point, because how can you prove that your bronchitis was as a result from just one plane flight? It's likely she had been exposed to a lot of tobacco smoke throughout her whole life, or had other pre-existing medical conditions causing the bronchitis. So that was an interesting case though. So smoking was banned in Australia on the 1st of December 1987, which made Australia the first country to implement the ban, and then it followed on international flights in 1990. So one of the issues that was considered in that case was whether Qantas was required to give a warning of the effect of environmental tobacco smoke to patients. It was held that they were, so that was part of their duty of care to give that warning. But then the issue was that the breach didn't actually cause her harm. And they looked at what the effect would be on that warning. So let's just go back to our elements and see if we can apply them. Time limits. If it's 3 years from the date the cause of action arose, you might be okay, because remember, the cause of action includes all of the elements of negligence. So it also includes damage. So you need to have a diagnosable injury or illness. So as long as you bring your claim within 3 years from the date of diagnosis, you're probably okay. That could be really difficult though, and you'd have to review it depending on when the illness comes up. Duty of care. If we look at the issue of tobacco more broadly, we could look at whether a tobacco company or the government owes a duty of care to consumers or passive smokers. So during the mid-20th century, negligence claims against tobacco companies were viewed skeptically. There were a few people that tried. So there was this growing body of opinion to say that negligence was, that tobacco was actually linked with cancer and airway diseases. But then it heightened in 1964 when the US federal government commissioned a report, and this was called the Surgeon General's Report on Smoking and Tobacco Use. And in that report, it actually, for the first time ever, linked smoking to these specific diseases. So from 1964, there is clear evidence to show that tobacco causes really serious illness and death. However, 30 years later, it took Australia 30 years to catch on. It's a bit of a gap, isn't it? So when we look at this issue of duty of care, up until now, and even now, in Australia, our position, when you're looking at some of these controversial cases, is that we're very domestic. We consider ourselves as a little cell in the world. And when we're looking at this duty of care issue, we like to confine that to within our own jurisdiction or the body of knowledge that we hold in our country, so in our laws themselves. I think there's a growing argument now that that is expanding. And when you're looking at some of these, especially these multinational, international companies, that the duty of care should actually be a lot wider and should include these international standards. And if there is knowledge at an international level, it's not okay for Australia to keep claiming this little cell-like approach to looking at these issues. So there's a body of commentary which is saying, look, hey, Australia really needs to step up and start recognising that we are actors in a global and international community, and some of these duties that are being found in other places like Europe and the US, New Zealand even, some of these duties should be imposed on our governments and on the companies that operate here as well. But we still have a very tight, in terms of litigation to date about some of these issues, we're still using as one of our defences the jurisdiction issue. So even though we might be a signatory to some of these international standards, or we might be aware of them, they're not incorporated into our domestic laws. If they're not incorporated into our domestic laws, then we're arguing, well, hey, we haven't actually breached any duty of care because the duty of care doesn't exist in our little domestic sphere. So that's just an interesting point when we're looking at some of these controversial international cases. The World Health Organization has now got a framework convention on tobacco control. It has legally binding obligations for its parties. We have signed up to that. It sets the foundation for reducing both the demand for and supply of tobacco products, and it provides comprehensive direction for tobacco control policy. So that's one thing that you could talk about there in terms of our duty of care now as a government, having signed that convention, then that would form the scope of the duty of care. We need to make sure that we comply with that. And to a large extent, we need to make sure that tobacco companies are complying with that. So tobacco companies don't sign that convention, do they? It's just countries that sign that. So then the country has a responsibility, and usually it's in the convention itself, to regulate or make sure that the companies are complying with the current standards. So if you were the victim of passive smoking and there's a breach of duty on the part of the government, on the part of a tobacco company, then you might also want to be suing the government and relying on this issue about the government not regulating companies correctly or properly because the government is now aware of these standards. So breach of the duty of care, the litigation has found that the companies or governments have fallen below a reasonable standard of care in providing lack of warnings to consumers, so the risks of smoking. But then the other thing is that often there's been inappropriate marketing, advertising, and sales. So a lot of the cases were about marketing to target groups that are more at risk of developing the illnesses, such as pregnant women and children. Causation, so has active or passive smoking caused the injury or illness? Well, now we have a really strong body of medical and scientific evidence to show that there is a direct correlation between active or passive smoking and illness, cancer, and death. So causation is probably not likely a problem. You might have factual causation though, depending on the circumstances in which the claim arises. So whether you can bring it back to that person's use of tobacco or whether there might be some other reasons why they've contracted their illness. And there might also be an issue as to showing that the breach of duty has actually caused the injury itself. So, or just even arguing the breach of duty now. Especially in Australia, the industry is pretty tightly regulated now. And we've got laws everywhere and there's signs up everywhere to say this is a no smoking zone, this is this, this is that. So it's probably quite a difficult area of litigation in Australia. It's almost been cancelled out. When it comes to damage, I'm going to say that this is a really controversial area in any event. So even if you do have litigation, because the damages have been capped in most jurisdictions, if smoking has, if a child, for example, has got a illness as a result of passive smoking, they're not going to receive much compensation because, as we know, because damages are capped, it's only really those claims that have really high amounts of economic loss. So you can prove that the illness is stopping that person from working. Perhaps in the elderly is another one where the damages might be controversial. So it's one of the areas that I think needs improvement, is because the damages are capped in Australia. There's a lot of people that are falling through where claims could be made, but they're just not worthwhile in terms of compensation. And then there's also the defence voluntary acceptance of the risk or contributory negligence. So if you take up smoking nowadays, then it's likely you're going to have that defence come in. But let's take this one step further and look at something that's really controversial. So we know now those tobacco companies are aware of a whole body of litigation which has occurred in the US, in Australia, in other countries. But what they're doing now is they're actually taking their products and marketing them to less regulated countries. And they're marketing them inappropriately. So I've got a really good YouTube that we're going to watch about this.
It's a Saturday night in Jakarta, and a battle of the bands known as Indie Fest is about to kick off. From loud music to bright lights to sexy girls. The whole thing is a honeypot for the young and restless. All put on and paid for by Jarum, a cigarette company owned by Indonesia's richest man. Tonight, the in-your-face hard sell is for LA Lights, Jarum's premium brand for the young and trendy.
Want to buy my cigarette? Hey, 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 hey!
The kids lap up the freebies, lighters and sometimes cigarettes as well. It's inescapable. In this town, it's virtually impossible to find a concert or a sporting event which isn't sponsored by corporate tobacco.
Philip Morris is one of the most brilliant marketers in the world. In a place like Indonesia, what they're doing is they're making tobacco use a form of Western independence and growth. What's even worse is they're hitting the exact images that appeal to Indonesian youth. It's the reason we're seeing such a dramatic rise in tobacco use among Indonesian youth.
I think it would be fair to characterize Indonesia as a rogue state when it comes to tobacco control.
When it comes to regulating tobacco, Indonesia keeps some decidedly unhealthy and unsavory friends. Like Zimbabwe, the only other place still allowing cigarette advertising on television. And North Korea, the only other Asian nation which has not signed up to Big Tobacco's arch-enemy, the World Health Organization's Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. It curbs advertising and outlaws sales to youngsters.
Indonesia is a very large market, third largest market for tobacco products in the world. Second, it's got the best regulation from a company's perspective. It's very, very loosely regulated. You can still sell tobacco to minors. There's no sort of pack warnings or very small pack warnings on the back of packets. The tax is low, and it's got a very high growth rate of young smokers. Young people are getting into smoking much more quickly, much earlier than they used to do. From a tobacco company's perspective, Indonesia's a paradise.
The marketing strategies of cigarette companies play a major role in a massive national habit. Among men, almost 70% light up every day. That's about 80 million smokers.
Today, the leadership of Philip Morris International and other tobacco companies have absolutely no moral compass whatsoever. They're willing to make as much money killing as many people using whatever tactics the law will allow. It's one of the most egregious moral and social violations of corporate responsibility that I can imagine.
Like most, this man, Ujang Widodo, started smoking as a young teenager, blissfully ignorant of the danger to his health.
Ya kalau udah kena penyakit, bukannya ini lagi sangat menyesal, gitu kan? Kenapa? Bukan dari dulu saya berhenti. Kalau tahu saya kena penyakit begini ya, berhenti aja dari dulu ya kan? Gitu. Jadi ya menyesal ya, mungkin penyesalan itu ada.
Now he's just 45 and stricken with lung cancer. He's undergoing chemotherapy, part of the enormous and growing caseload in hospitals across the archipelago.
Jadi hidup saya ini ngambang gitu. Karena ya takut umur kita semua sampai di situ gitu kan. Maka saya sekuat tenaga mempertahankan hidup saya.
Like anywhere else in the world, the prognosis for lung cancer is not good. Up to 400,000 Indonesians die each year from smoking-related illnesses. 25,000 of them not even smokers.
Dokter itu mengatakan harus di kemo gitu, baru mau tindakan ini di kemo, ntar dilihat perkembangannya gimana gitu. Insya Allah saya optimis, saya kan masih muda.
Hasido is 25 years old. She has a 4-month-old baby and lung cancer. She's one of the many hapless victims of Indonesia's choking haze of second-hand cigarette smoke.
This is the chest X-ray of the female patient, 25 years old. She came to us with the breathlessness. She has cough and a fever. And when we did the chest X-ray, we found that in the right lung of this patient, kind of the mass. Then we did the CT scan of the thorax, and we found a big mass in the right part of the lung. Then we can say that the patient has the lung cancer.
And why does this young woman of 25 years old, why does she have lung cancer?
I think because she was a passive smoker. Her father and her brother smoke in the home.
Kadang-kadang marah juga kalau pada bukan tempatnya gitu. Sebenarnya kadang-kadang juga kesel ya. Paling sebatas itu doang. Emang namanya orang kan nggak bisa dilarang istilah.
Do you think that too many people smoke in Indonesia? Do you have an opinion about that?
Banyak. Banyaknya merokok.
Most lung cancer goes undiagnosed in Indonesia. Those few who do make it to hospital are usually past the point of no return. Hasido is relatively young and feeling positive. She wants to survive for the sake of her baby. We'll monitor her battle with this insidious illness. A key reason for smoking's decline in countries like Australia has been that these days the habit burns a real hole in your pocket. But here in Indonesia, smokes remain very, very cheap. A packet like this will cost you about $1, and homemade brands in rural areas can sell for a quarter of that. That's because in this country, taxes on cigarettes are among the lowest in the world. To find out why, we travelled into the archipelago's own Marlboro country, out in East Java, where Kretek is king, Indonesia's pungent clove cigarette. These are Indonesia's killing fields, taking more lives every year than Aceh's devastating tsunami. But even among many Indonesian tobacco farmers, there's either breathtaking ignorance or stubborn denial. We meet Abdul Hadi, who says he doesn't believe a lifetime's habit has been detrimental to his health.
30 tahun merokok. Saya sesaan. Napas.
How did smoking for 30 years affect your health?
Sama saja, tidak apa-apa.
Certainly, Abdul's wife, Holifa, remains oblivious to the dangers of smoking.
Enggak, sebetulnya tidak bikin sakit. Rokok itu tidak bikin sakit. Karena napasnya itu sesak, berhenti merokok gini. Enggak bikin penyakit rokok ini.
And Holifa is unperturbed that her teenage son is already a seasoned smoker.
Enggak ada apa-apa. kalau orang merokok itu katanya orang Indonesia jantan, kalau tidak merokok itu ya apa
Buat saya sendiri ya baik lah. Kan bisa menghilangkan pikiran yang sumpek dengan merokok, bisa tenang gitu. Kalau udah ngerokok pikiran tuh sumpek terus gitu.
Hukum tata negara. In the world's most populous Muslim nation, you'd think an edict from the country's top council of Islamic scholars, the MUI, would count for something. Recently, it considered declaring a fatwa on smoking as being haram or forbidden. One of the nation's religious leaders, Holil Ridwan, believes smoking is evil.
Ya juga kalau gitu rokok itu adalah sama dengan senjata pembunuh massal, gitu. Sama dengan senjata biologi dan senjata kimia yang bisa menghabisi satu bangsa kalau dia merokok semua gitu kan.
At this farmers' rally in central Java, tobacco triumphs over theology. The giant cigarette is inscribed with the words, "Cigarettes are not poison." The banner behind reads, "Revoke the MUI edict. It's amoral, barbaric." In the end, the MUI decided that it's only children and pregnant women who are forbidden to smoke. Even that was enough to provoke a life or death response from Java's tobacco farmers. Pressure from the tobacco industry has successfully kept the government from raising cigarette taxes. The hand-rolling of critics was a frenzied display of human dexterity. These have twice the nicotine and 3 times the tar of regular cigarettes. Critics account for 90% of the hundreds of billions of cigarettes sold in Indonesia each year. And because they rely on manual labour, hand-rolled critics are taxed much less than their machine-made competitors. The margins are very profitable and very attractive to companies like Philip Morris and British American Tobacco. Their biggest sellers here are hand-rolled critics. Even small local producers like Samsudi know when they're onto a good thing.
Peningkatannya sangat bagus sekali. Per tahun kita ada peningkatan antara 20 sampai 25%.
The Indonesian government talks about future tax increases, but for now it's happy to sit on its hands, while more and more Indonesian smokers send themselves to an early grave. It's an argument lost on Hasido, the young passive smoke victim fighting lung cancer. When we revisited her in hospital, she was still awaiting her chemotherapy treatment.
Iya, sekarang enakan. Cuma untuk kemo belum memenuhi syarat.
How do you feel about being away from your baby?
Rasanya sedih, kangen. Ya, nggak terbayangkan lah. Namanya saya baru punya anak. Ya, pengennya setiap hari ketemu.
When do you think you'll see him again?
Selesai kemo, kata dokternya bisa langsung dipulang.
In the meantime, her little boy is being cared for by his grandmother, who sells cigarettes for a living. When Hasido gave birth 4 months ago, her husband left her because he could no longer afford the medical bills.
Ya mudah-mudahan sih sembuh gitu saya. Saya kesian banget ya begitu namanya anak. Mudah-mudahan sembuh, Allah ngasih sembuh lah. Pengennya saya sembuh, Bu. Nggak sampai.
She tells us Hasido was brought up not only by her smoking father, but by a grandfather who was a heavy smoker. But like so many here, there's denial about the effects of tobacco. She doesn't believe her daughter is sick because she was surrounded by smokers. How did the grandfather die?
Ya bapaknya tadinya dia sakit batuk dibawa ke dokter katanya paru-paru. Tahu-taunya ya biasa tapi sehat, nggak kayak gituan banget, nggak bisa bangun kayak habis itu kagak, bangun biasa bangun makan apa sehat, tapi cuman batuk-batuk.
As thousands of Indonesians perish each week, tobacco companies prosper. After all, here is a marketplace with next to no regulatory hurdles. For big tobacco, under siege in the shrinking markets of the developed world, this is a golden opportunity for growth. The big players are swooping in for the kill. This year, British American Tobacco, the makers of Lucky Strike, paid more than $600 million for a majority stake in Bentoel, a smaller Indonesian tobacco company. Sampurna is one of Indonesia's big three tobacco giants. It was bought in 2005 by the world's largest tobacco corporation, Philip Morris International, the creators of Marlboro and the Marlboro Man. Over the years, Sampurna's products could be credited with millions of premature deaths.
Come to where the flavor is. Come to Marlboro Country.
See that the SBM, or the white cigarette segment, has declined by 0.7.
The new chief of Philip Morris in Indonesia is old enough to remember when the Marlboro Man commercials screened on television and in cinemas in his home country. He's a Brit who headed up the company's operations in Australia.
Just a couple of questions for John Gledhill.
He refused our request for an interview, but we caught up with him at a shareholders forum.
Your products continue to be promoted and advertised at music events, sporting events, cultural events. Look, it's pretty clear, despite often denials, that this sort of marketing is aimed at younger smokers. Now, given that you are from Australia, you know the reality of what tobacco does to people. On a personal level, how is your conscience?
On a personal level, my conscience is fine, actually. I work for a company which I believe not only follows the law by the letter, but also in the spirit as well.
Internal Philip Morris documents obtained by Foreign Correspondent confirm that the company is very focused on enticing young Indonesians to sample their deadly wares. Philip Morris's documents refer to its A-Mile brand of Kretek cigarettes as the aspirational brand for young adult smokers. The documents say the company's marketing goal is to generate trial and repurchase. That is, to get the young hooked on their product. Just to be clear, are you saying that your advertising and promotions, which are all about musical and sporting events, are not trying to attract young smokers?
Our advertising, which is not just in music, by the way, is aimed at smokers and is aimed at persuading existing smokers to switch from competitive brands into our own brands. That's the aim of our advertising.
Philip Morris has no credibility when it argues that all it's trying to do is switching adult smokers from one brand to another. It's exactly the same lie they told in the United States and in other countries until their own documents expose that that simply isn't the case.
Against the enormous momentum of the marketing push, there are meagre, haphazard attempts to rein in smoking. Some local governments have banned smoking in public places, but enforcement is a half-hearted affair. Indonesian politicians don't even obey the laws they do put in place. Smoking is banned in the nation's parliament building, but every day parliamentarians are lighting up inside. Indonesia's health minister, Siti Fadila Supari, is not afraid of making controversial statements. She's best known for suggesting that the United States might be using Indonesia's strain of the bird flu virus to develop new biological weapons. You don't think smoking kills people? But she wasn't happy to be asked about smoking.
I don't ask about smoking.
Why not? It's killing hundreds of thousands of Indonesians every year.
I'm ready for that. I'm ready for that.
It's difficult to know what to make of Health Minister Supari's explanation for not signing up to the World Health Organization's treaty, which would make life much more difficult for big tobacco here. Health Minister, do you know what she says? It's too late for Indonesia to sign. Do you know what the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control is?
Yes, I know. But FCTC, yeah.
And why doesn't Indonesia sign it? You're the Health Minister. Why doesn't Indonesia sign it?
Yes.
It certainly is too late for Hasido. She never did see her baby boy again. She died just 2 days after we last spoke to her in hospital. But even as Hasido's friends and family gather to mourn her passing, they're still reluctant to accept that tobacco is a killer. But some are learning, if a little too late. As Atib Sajid lays his daughter to rest, he bemoans his addiction to a 30-year-old habit.
Ya, kalau udah terjadi sebenarnya nyesel, cuman mau bagaimana ya, udah terlanjur begini gitu. Palingnya dikurangin.
Mau sehat lagi lah. Jadinya itu kayak begitu dan mau sehat lagi. Gitu. Itu nggak mikir mati lah.
Hasido's death is a grim reminder that over the next 5 years, the families of at least 2 million Indonesians lose loved ones before their time to diseases caused by smoking. The deadly dilemma for Indonesia is how much longer it puts tobacco industry profits before the health of its people.
So that was a pretty intense video, wasn't it, about Indonesia? It's a little bit older, 2009, but the position still remains the same in that the government is highly unregulated and the tobacco industry is increasing over there. So the question that I would pose to you in terms of looking at negligence is, do you think tobacco companies, in light of the evidence that they have in developed nations where there are laws in place and where governments have signed the World Health Organization standards, that it would be within their scope of the duty of care to not take advantage of unregulated societies in the marketing and distribution of their products? So that's the question. In terms of the legal framework for bringing a negligence action, so a citizen, for example, or the family of the 25-year-old woman with the 4-month-old baby that died, to bring that negligence claim, what laws would they rely upon? So that's where it comes to that issues of jurisdiction again. Certainly all of the elements of negligence are there, I think, in any event. But then what jurisdictional, what laws or framework of laws would you be relying upon to bring your claim? Because, you know, we know negligence in terms of Queensland legislation. So in Queensland, we could bring a claim, but in Indonesia, they don't quite have those levels of laws yet. So that makes the tobacco industry and what they're doing, that makes the issues of negligence that are arising, it's quite controversial, and definitely in terms of jurisdictional issues, and really whether they're taking advantage of the fact that laws aren't strict or tight when it comes to the issue. It's not just smoking as well that's caused a lot of the litigation. We've also now got litigation all over the world about tobacco farming, so the dangers of tobacco farming and how this is causing health-related illnesses, and also the environmental impact of tobacco farming. So there has been negligence cases about tobacco farming. And then, of course, moving from tobacco to the new fandangled thing is this idea about e-cigarettes and vaporizers. Somebody that I know has decided to take up e-cigarettes instead of smoking cigarettes, and, you know, is claiming that they're the next best thing, rah. Well, I went to town researching the stuff that is in these vaporizers and e-cigarettes. Is just lethal. The chemicals that they are putting into these things are just lethal. So in the US, they have actually been legalized in some parts. In Australia, they haven't yet. We're still looking at a legal regime around the e-cigarettes and vaporizers. They are available. I think you can purchase them over the internet. We've got a CSIRO report at the moment. It's not saying anything. So at the moment, it just says it contains carcinogenic compounds and carcinogenic metabolites, but it's not saying that they're dangerous. Yet, in a lot of these products, there's things in them that are banned by our Therapeutic Goods and Administration Act. So they are actually illegal in our market, yet they're still filtering through. And some brands are actually coming through now, which are okay, yet there's not the same types of warnings and so forth that have been placed around them. So the law is trying to catch up now in terms of this area about sort of, you know, this modern way of smoking, which is supposedly better for you. So that's another controversial area, which we'll see this grow over the next sort of decade, I can imagine. Asbestos. This is another area where we have seen decades of litigation. So exposure to asbestos, we all probably know what asbestos is by now. It's a particular fibre which is found in building products, and it was invented by a company called James Hardie and then distributed all throughout the world, actually. But I think it started, I'm not actually sure where it started, whether it was the US or I know it was massive in Australia. So breathing in one of these fibres can cause asbestosis, which means that the fibre actually lodges in your lung and then can cause irritation, painfulness, like asthma, loss of breathlessness. But then it can go one step further and cause a particular type of cancer called mesothelioma. So mesothelioma is lethal. If you're diagnosed with mesothelioma, the doctors usually give you between 4 to 12 months, 12 months if you're lucky. Symptoms leading up to a diagnosis could include shortness of breath, chronic pain near the cancer, weight loss, fluid buildup, and also bowel obstruction, because you've got this mass which is sort of sitting on everything. It's a hideous illness which causes an awful death. A death where the air is taken away from your body, because you can't oxygenate your body. Your things start to shut down, so you'll get loss of airflow into your fingers and your toes, and then your limbs, and then your arms, and just everything starts to shut down in on you, and you can't breathe. It's just awful. It causes toxicity throughout your whole body, because what does air do? It oxygenates our blood, doesn't it? And our blood is vital in moving through our body and keeping us clean, basically. So a hideous, a horrible, a painful death. We've had decades of litigation about asbestos, mainly against the James Hardie Group itself. The litigation focused around people that worked in the mines or they worked in the industry. There was also partners and children of those that worked with these products or in the mines or the industry, because some of the partners contracted mesothelioma because they had exposure to the work clothes. They were putting work clothes in the wash, for example, and then getting the fibres on their skin and then breathing them in. The science says that all it takes is one fibre to cause asbestosis, and that asbestosis can turn into mesothelioma. One fibre, that's all it takes. We can't even see it. I mean, what does a fibre look like? It's teeny. And then there's also litigation about the dumping grounds for asbestos. So the byproducts of asbestos were dumped in places all throughout Australia, and children grew up there playing in these dumping grounds. A lot of Indigenous communities out west have been subjected to asbestos exposure from the mines and the byproducts of the mines. So where is the negligence if we go back to our elements? The duty of care. So relatively early on, actually, James Hardie, the company that created this product, was aware. They had internal scientists that looked at their products, and they were advised early on that these products, the fibre in these products, could cause significant illness or death. That body of evidence built, they knew that their products were lethal. So instead of discontinuing the production and the use of the products, they actually withheld that evidence, and they continued to promote, produce, and dump the products, knowing this. So they had knowledge, they knew of this, which endangered their workers, the consumers, the householders, and communities. Certainly, as the litigation built and people were dying, and there was more widespread knowledge about asbestos fibres, the company still continued to sell their products. So I guess it's probably a bit like our tobacco industry, isn't it? You've got a company that has full knowledge, yet they're still continuing to promote and sell these lethal products. Now there's another wave of litigation that's happening, and that's renovators that have, there's pretty much asbestos nearly everywhere, isn't there? If you travel anywhere around Brisbane, houses that were built in the 50s to the 70s or earlier, there's there's asbestos everywhere. Where I live, there's asbestos fences. They're broken, you know. I walk past them and I shudder and I think, oh my goodness, it just takes one fiber. I have small children. You know, it's nerve-wracking to know that we live in a lethal environment when it comes to asbestos. So I found a good article here that we can look at. Oh, that's just while I got that up, that's the World Health Organization report on tobacco and its environmental impact. So you can look at that later. Okay, so here's our new wave of asbestos claims. Relatively recent article. Got a nice video here. Ignore the ad. Oh look, you get salad on planes now, not smoking. That's a bit better, isn't it?
When I heard there was asbestos here, I was pretty dumbfounded. I couldn't believe that it would be like, you know, weren't notified. And I just kept saying to my brother, are you serious? Are you sure? You know, until they sent over some reports. And I was then like, that then turned into a bit of anger, you know. I mean, we've been living here our entire lives and not notified of what's really going on. Look around, you can see that my mum's put her heart and soul into this garden. It is her heart and soul. You find her here 6 o'clock in the morning. She spends literally a lot of time in here, like maybe too much time. But yeah, so we eat a lot of the produce that comes out of here, you know, parsley for tabbouleh, for example, the vine leaves for Lebanese food, you know, everything, the lemons from the lemon tree. So, you know, and we have done that since we were children. We've eaten the produce that's grown here. I don't think I'd want to eat from the produce, like, you know, from the food. How do I know what kind of damage it would cause? Like, what studies have, you know, at the end of the day, we're consuming it. You know, we're not just breathing it, we're consuming food that's actually planted in that soil. So I know I wouldn't be eating from that produce. I wouldn't be coming down here. I probably wouldn't even really want to live here anymore. Asbestos is dangerous. Like, they can say it's not dangerous, but we don't know what the risks are. At the end of the day, it's been around in the media for a long time. We know that there's issues with it. For the house that I live on to be formerly a dumping ground and for me not to know about it, it doesn't even sound right. Like, to say it doesn't sound right. It just doesn't sound right at all, does it?
And so there you go. There's another probably whole raft of litigation that's going to come up in the next few years, is what asbestos does to you when you're eating it or ingesting it, or you've got it in the soil. I mean, because this is a fibre, the fibres, asbestos, it's not sustainable, so it doesn't break down. It is a chemical, it stays in the environment. It will affect us as humans. So that's interesting. Now, there's this great documentary. So much like the tobacco industry, we've now got asbestos companies going out into the third world. So let's have a look at this.
The factories have been closed in the West and opened up in India to take advantage of lax laws. This is what makes me mad and what makes me travel the world. Must stop. Largest asbestos waste dump in India and possibly even South Asia.
nearly 600,000 square meters of asbestos waste.
I never knew about the harm of the asbestos. Even the workers, they were not knowing. Otherwise, they would have not worked over here.
And the children didn't know either.
No, nobody knew.
What do you think of fiber?
बीमारी होती है इससे
Okay.
हमारे अम्मा के विचार मेरे दादा दादी के
There's a huge rise in the use of asbestos in India. Indian cities are riddled with asbestos.
Now the asbestos should be banned totally.
No, sir. Do you speak English? Can I talk to you about the situation in Kazakhstan and Russia?
What's happened is nothing less than corporate homicide. If you made a decision that has cost the lives of people, then you should be held accountable for it in a criminal court.
So there you go. It looks like we're following a bit of a pattern of behaviour, aren't we? Answer the question again. Should the scope of the duty of care to any company that produces products with asbestos in them extend to not marketing or distributing their products in unregulated countries, taking advantage of unregulated, less developed nations in order to make sales, basically? Is that negligence? Well, some people argue it's not just negligence, it's actually criminal negligence. So same principles though, isn't it? So that's interesting. That's going to be probably the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 100 years in India, because we know how hideous asbestos has been in first world or developed nations. So we know in Australia what's happened is that there's a fund now that's been set up by the government, who is always trying to seek money from the James Hardie Group. But the James Hardie Group only contributes about a third of the money that gets paid out in compensation under that fund. So it's actually the taxpayers that are footing the bill for, or most of the bill for the damage that has occurred because of asbestos. Okay, moving on to obesity. Do we think obesity is an issue in which we could sue for negligence? It's interesting. It's probably the next new controversial area or body of law, much like tobacco and asbestos, I guess. So obesity, we know that it causes a lot of stuff, a lot of health issues, damage, illness, multiple sclerosis, asthma, diabetes, cancer, high blood pressure, heart failure, dementia, depression. Who should be held responsible for the obesity problem? In the USA, there's been a lot of litigation, especially in relation to fast foods. There's been children that have tried to recover damages against fast food franchises for the failure to warn them of the health effects of their foods, making and selling unsafe foods. Then the issue in these cases has always been the free will of individuals and the personal responsibility of individuals to consume what they like and what they want whenever they want. And there's the issue of causation. Is there a direct link between the person's obesity or whatever their health condition is, the diabetes, the asthma, that sort of thing, and the food that they are consuming? And then how could you just shift it onto one onto one distributor? So for McDonald's example, because somebody just doesn't eat McDonald's all the time, do they? They eat all sorts of different brands of food. So the issues have really been lying in those areas. And we're not seeing a consistent body of litigation arising. What causes obesity? So this issue of causation, there's so many different causes. There's all of this evidence now which is showing that we've got a rise in high-fat diets, there's a lack of exercise, there's increasing number of fats in the food chain, there's technology which is making people more inactive, people are comfort eating, there's a lack of awareness, there might be medical and genetic factors, there's a rise in high sugar diets. So look at all of those factors when it comes into play of causation. So when we talk about factual causation, this is a really good example. You'd have to say that the illness or the injury, the breach of the duty of care, so marketing fast food to young children has materially contributed to the injury or the illness, so that you could prove this factual causation. What's material contribution? You can think about it in terms of more than half, so more than 50% it's contributed to their condition. So it'd be pretty hard, wouldn't it? I mean, looking at all of those things, like we've got a list of 8 things there, it'd be hard to show that material contribution. We have a doctor in New South Wales, 2013, sorry, not a doctor, a case in New South Wales, an interesting one where a morbidly obese man sued his doctor for failing to provide a referral for bariatric surgery, and then he went on to develop liver cancer. So that's taking it to the next level. So we're not now trying to sue the food companies or the people that are creating the food. Now we're trying to shift the focus onto the medical system. If I have an obesity problem, should there be a duty of care on doctors to act in a certain way? The Court of Appeal found, no, actually, we think that's going too far. It's not part of a doctor's duty of care in 1998, anyway, to refer. As you know, I was involved in that big group action of claimants that had underwent a certain type of weight loss surgery, and this issue didn't come up. So in terms of a doctor's duty of care to refer, in terms of the issue, it was framed more such as, or when we were talking to the medical experts, they were saying, look, a doctor has a duty to advise of options that one could take, and then it's up to the patient to be fully informed of those options and then undertake those if they so choose. So it is a developing and interesting area of law, but we're sort of neither here nor there at the moment in terms of, well, should we be regulating food companies more heavily or not? When these people are hitting our medical system, is there some special treatment that we should be bringing in place or not? Where's the negligence? At the moment, I think the general view is still that is pushed back onto the consumer, in that you should just be aware that eating poorly is not good and you should just not eat poorly. Which I tend to disagree with now, because what's happening is that the products which are being produced contain so many ingredients which are contributing to obesity that it's actually really difficult to even be aware of what those products are, how much we are consuming, and having access to low fat and low sugar foods, but not only that, nutritionally dense or nutritionally high foods that are real and good for us. And as you know, that's the area of research that I'm currently looking at, and looking at how companies maybe should be regulated for this issue, because like the tobacco industry, like asbestos, the body of knowledge is now in the scientific and medical community is such that we can see that our foods are actually killing us. So we've reached that next level now of awareness about that. So in terms of negligence claims, we might see actually in the next 10, 20, 30 years that this is a really litigious area, that these claims just keep coming and coming and coming and coming because we're not addressing the problem adequately. Okay, so what about sugar? Sugar's been a big one that's everywhere in the media and so forth. I found this funny YouTube video about this 14-year-old girl. I don't know who she is. She's got quite a high following. So she must be some serial blogger or somebody. Anyway, what I eat in a day, 14-year-old girl. Let's have a look at this. I'll just go through it quickly. We can kind of see
a what I eat in a day video for like a typical 14-year-old girl. And my diet is not the best. Like, I'm not saying that this is like a healthy diet, because I know a lot of these are like for healthy eaters, but I'm basically just going to realistically show you what I'll eat in a day. So it's a Sunday, it's like 10:30, and I'm going to go get some breakfast. But before I do that, I'm going to put on a jumper and some fluffy socks because it's absolutely freezing. Like, I'm not sure if you can really see.
So look, it's snowing outside. Anyway, let's see. We'll just roll through and okay.
We just like chocolate inside these little things, and it's really.
So that's her breakfast. She has yummy chocolate, sugar for breakfast. Yum. With milk, and most of us know now that milk full of sugar as well. Oh, skim milk as well. Okay, so that's breakfast. Let's move up. What she consumes. Okay, now she's having orange juice. So most orange juice is about 50% sugar. Let's have a look here. She's in bed looking at her phone. Yeah. Okay.
Sure, it's quite late to have lunch, to be fair.
Okay, she's having lunch.
My mum's just made some lunch.
Well, look,
so I
there's
have
some cucumber,
cucumber, tomato, and then a burger. So it's like an Aldi burger with cheese and an Aldi bun. Honestly, Aldi burgers are so good.
So there's probably quite a bit of sugar in that white bread. I don't even know what those little hoopy things are. She had some green stuff on her plate. Oh, look.
One of these muffins, which is really good. And
chocolate chip
I think
muffin.
it's from Aldi, because you can get like a pack
from
of
Aldi. We all shop at Aldi because food's really
muffins are so
expensive
good.
now,
Also,
isn't it?
it's really good. And now I think I'm gonna like really tidy my room because my room's like really messy. Like,
nice.
It's not good. So yeah, I'm gonna tidy my room.
Okay. Oh, here we go.
Aldi double.
She's had double muffin.
Really good, and I think we're having
cheesecake for dessert. Cheesecake for dessert
really
for
nice.
tea. Then she goes on chatty. Oh, here we go. She makes a hot chocolate.
Use hot chocolate because it's a sugar. And then I'm gonna get out the squirty cream.
Ooh, the squirty cream. Who has that stuff in their fridge? My goodness. Now she makes the hot chocolate. Squirty cream. I mean, look at that. Look at that. Sugar on sugar on sugar. And then later, she talks about dinner. She doesn't actually show us what she has for dinner, but they have packet lasagna and that packet cheesecake that she showed us before. So there you go. What I eat in a day, average 14-year-old girl. How much does that mirror our society? I mean, look at you. Are you studying at the moment? Are you cramming for your assessments? What are you eating? So in the United States, a 14-year-old girl claimed that high fructose corn syrup caused her type 2 diabetes. So one of the biggest things at the moment is corn syrup. We're finding it in everything. It has been shown to be linked to adverse health effects, especially excessive consumption. We're finding it in everything. Go to the supermarket and look at the ingredients and you will see high fructose corn syrup in nearly everything. So she failed, again, based on causation. So there was not enough proof to show that her consumption of the high fructose corn syrup actually caused her type 2 diabetes. I think as the body of medical evidence and the scientific evidence grows, we might find that some of this litigation starts to become quite successful. Too much sugar. If we acknowledge that fast food contains high levels of fat, cholesterol, salt, and sugar, and that these ingredients are bad for our health, what are some reasons why food manufacturers are not liable? So if we know that these things are causing serious problems, they're costing our health system a lot of money, why are food manufacturers not liable? Good question. There's actually no reason why they shouldn't be liable. And that's one developing area of law and one that I'm doing a lot of research in as well. Our current diet guidelines in Australia, it's quite fascinating. We don't, here we go. Nutrition Australia, conveniently, we have no guideline about daily intakes of sugar. Why is that? Probably because we recognise that we don't even need sugar. Of course, there's naturally occurring sugars in fruits and vegetables and grains and so forth. So there's no recommended daily intake for sugar. The World Health Organization has looked at this issue. They started looking at this problem. They're identifying it as a chronic international problem, especially in first world or developed countries, diet-related illnesses. And they've brought out a publication here about nutrition and sugar intake, which is fascinating to read. It's quite difficult to read it though. So they recommend a reduced intake of free sugars throughout the life course. In both adults and children, they recommend reducing the intake of free sugars to less than 10% of total energy intake. They suggest a further reduction of the intake to below 5% of total energy intake because they recognise that 10% is still quite high. And then they talk about, well, what is total energy intake? Energy comes from macronutrients, fat, carbohydrates, including total sugars. Righty. It's quite difficult, isn't it? I mean, I'm just an average lay person that knows a little bit about health and diet, but to get my head around this is still quite difficult. I've got the World Health Organization now making these recommendations, but in my mind, I still don't know how to read kilojoules and calories and those sorts of things, let alone add them up from all the foods that I eat, let alone correlate them with the ingredients that are actually in the food. There are apps for it, diet apps and so forth. I've tried doing that. It's quite fun, but they still don't tell you, what the recommended intakes are, or the link between, okay, I've consumed this and therefore I'm going to end up with this illness. And like free sugars include monosaccharides. Who knows what that is? Disaccharides. Who knows what that is? And sugars naturally present in honey, syrups, fruit juices, and fruit juice concentrates. So in my mind, this is what I've got figured out. I have this much food in a day. 10% should be sugar. Well, I should limit that to 10% sugars, which is like that. And then that's even bad for me, so I should make it 5%. And then, of course, there's a lot more sort of carbohydrate. There's a lot more kilojoules and so forth in some things than there are in other things. So that because of those factors, probably like that. So when we're talking about teaspoons of sugar, it's probably like 1 teaspoon a day. Interesting, isn't it? Let's go back to our 14-year-old girl. How many teaspoons of sugar did she have in one day? Pretty much 90, probably 90% of what she ate that day was sugar, wasn't it? Sugar and fat. That's pretty full on. So doesn't look like she's suffering from obesity. I know that if you watch her video properly, she's very active, but we now know that sugar is causing other diet-related illnesses like cancer. So it's a bit scary. And food manufacturers know this stuff. So we're still putting sugar in everything. Why is that? Okay, our next controversial topic. This is a big one. Asylum seekers. Such a big issue in Australia. It's always in the media. It's always comes around when there's federal elections. It's been used as for the platforms for political campaigns. One of the biggest cases was the Children Overboard, or the Tampa, under the Howard era, and that's when a lot of the legislation, the really intense legislation, started to come about. We now have these offshore processing centres in Manus Island and Nauru, Papua New Guinea. There's so much that has happened in this area, and there's so much litigation, and a lot of it is about negligence. So negligence on the part of the government in how we are dealing with these people. The United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees is the main international legal document which relates to refugee protection. It outlines who is a refugee and the rights of them, and legal obligations of states towards refugees and asylum seekers. So we were one of the first countries to become a state party to this refugee convention. Now there's been so much litigation and so much in this area since then that the United Nations and Amnesty International and other human rights organisations are basically saying that we are in complete violation of our human rights obligations, which we signed up to. We would have heard about back in 2015, the baby Feroz case. Feroz, I can't remember how to say it. So there was a mum who was pregnant. They were in detention in Darwin. She was suffering during that pregnancy. Reluctantly was flown to Brisbane, I think, for medical care and to birth the baby. The lawyers got involved. It was argued that the baby should be granted a protection visa, and the mother, and there was all of this stuff going back and forward because they were going to go back into detention. So even in exceptional circumstances where people need medical care and assistance, and we're still putting them back into these detention centres, which are effectively like prisons. So back to our elements of negligence, the litigation in this area, the duty of care, issues that have come up, the safety and interactions of arrival to the country. So in the case of the Children Overboard or the Tampa, the HMAS, the Navy was instructed to turn the boats around and not actually collect the people that were drowning in the water, for example. So that's one thing. How are we dealing with these people? Is the government negligent in that way in terms of their duty of care? Whilst they're in detention, are there fair processing times? Are we providing care for vulnerable groups, or